Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome. Thank you all for coming along tonight. So I'm Sarah Hewitt, the chair, and I have Megan Orme-Whitlock hiding in the background doing my technical support for this evening. On behalf of the New Zealand Society of Genealogists, I'd like to present me doing mistakes I've made. We've all made mistakes in our genealogy, and tonight I'm going to cover off just 5 of them. I've made quite a few more, but these are the 5 biggies. So, mistake number 1. We're going to start off with my great-great-grandmother, Emily Kinley Wilson, Mrs. Robert William Black. Now, when I was growing up, the most exciting thing about Emily was that she was born here. Now, I'd be quite surprised if you recognized it, because it's a place called Cressona, Pennsylvania. And when I was young, being a 16th American was really, really exciting. Now, through a series of events, she ended up here in New Zealand. And this is a photograph of her in old age with her husband, Robert William, and her oldest son, Robert Frederick, and his family. The great thing about researching women here in New Zealand is that we started a bit early with a lot of records that didn't start later in other countries. For example, suffrage. So Emily appears on the 1893 women's suffrage petition. She's right down there at the bottom. And so from that, I started to look for her on the electoral roll, but I couldn't find her. Now, when I was looking, you do need to bear in mind that the electoral roll for 1893 had not been indexed anywhere, and I think I was probably looking on the fiche. I found her husband. He's in Christchurch. There he is, Robert William Black in Worcester Street, but she's not there with him. And so, and let this be a warning to everybody, because the internet will remember you forever, this is what I wrote on her entry on the women's suffrage petition on the NZ History website. I just thought maybe she'd been out for tea with the girls one day and the petition had gone past and she'd signed it. Following the fact that I couldn't find her, I just left it. And I stopped researching her, thinking that she was probably the normal middle-aged housewife type and that nothing more to be found. A while later at my Kilburnie branch, Graham Langton, who used to work at Archives, did a presentation on naturalizations. And one of the slides he put up looks something like this. This is taken from the definitive list of people who were naturalized. And I was a little bit surprised to see American on the list. Americans are aliens. Explains a lot, doesn't it, really? Now, Graham went on to explain that, of course, because Emily had married Robert William Black, who was a British subject, she'd taken on the nationality of her husband, and therefore she wouldn't need naturalizations. But still, I went home that day and thought, let's just go and have a look in Archway to see if she's there. Of course, Archway, we won't get into that, but into Archway, there she was. I found she'd applied for naturalization. And of course, one of the perks of living here in Wellington is that I can just pop in and have a look. And so I did. And this is her naturalization form. Now, unlike many of you who will look for naturalization forms because you want to know more about where your family came from, I already knew this information. I was more interested in why and when she'd done it. The date on the bottom of the form said the 26th of September, 1893. Now, my education is quite Australian rather than New Zealand, and I knew 1893 was the year, but I wasn't sure about the date. So I had a look around the reading room for some information and discovered that women won the right to vote on the 19th of September, 1893. So exactly 1 week later, Emily was getting naturalised. What was going on here? I went into Papers Past to find out more information and came across what I believe to be the best newspaper headline ever. From her Pennsylvanian roots to this. Can alien ladies vote? It's kind of cool, you have to admit. And looking further into the Hansard, which is available on the Hathi Trust, discovered it had been debated twice in Parliament about whether or not women who were aliens by birth, in other words, not British, and had married British subjects, were then British and able to vote. And the consensus was both times that yes, they could. So I'm sorry, gentlemen, if you're watching, but obviously some officious man had decided that she wasn't allowed to vote when she wrote America as her birthplace. I did eventually find her in the electoral roll in Riccarton. Now, this is all to do with my knowledge of geography, and you'll realise as this presentation goes on that sometimes it's quite bad. And I would like to put a little plug in here for the Kiwi collection, because if I'd had the Kiwi collection at this point, I would have very, very, very quickly discovered that she lived in Riccarton and not one of the Christchurch electorates. And then I wouldn't have made a complete idiot of myself, because that thing on the NZ History website, it's still there. And of course, researching Emily, I discovered a whole lot of new things about her that I never knew before. Some of you may recognise this photograph. It's the National Council of Women from 1896. Kate Shepherd's smack bang in the middle, and up behind her is Emily. Now, she wasn't one of the delegates to the meeting. She was part of the organising committee. She was kind of there to make the tea. That's her up in the back corner there. Of course, this is another example of history being a foreign country and them doing things differently now. We would never have an advertisement for tea because a group of women had had a conference these days. So my mistake number one was not doing enough research, not figuring out where Emily might have lived, and coming to the wrong conclusions, concluding that she was just a normal housewife and nothing more exciting than that. Mistake number two. This involves my great-grandmother Greta, and this is a picture of her on the left, smiling. Doesn't she look happy? Now, on my family tree program, and some of you may recognise it as being legacy, I have a date of birth for her. Those of you that know legacy will also know that there is no red next to it saying that I put a source in against it. And for the longest time, this perplexed me because there is no birth certificate for Greta. When you look on the historical BDM and you look under Ocallaghan, which was her surname, and her parents, you find 4 siblings. Now, generally speaking, this would be a bit of a red flag, but Winifred and Jasper had 9 children and they only managed to register 4 of them. Now, there are lots of other documents that give me information about the family. Oh yeah, that's where I was going next. Sorry, losing my train of thought. Now, so why hadn't I written down what it was that, why hadn't I written down where I got this information from? Well, the simple thing is that when I started out and when I was looking for Greta's birth, there were basically 4 sources out there. So there were births, deaths and marriages, and in this case, the English ones, because that's where I was in England. There was the IGI, which at that point was on CD-ROM, and I still have very fond memories of the day I discovered that there was going to be this new website called Family Search. There was the 1881 census, which was on microfilm, well actually 2 microfilms, because you had to look the people up in the index and then find the page they were on. And there were wills and probates. So generally speaking, when you looked at a record on your family tree, it had to come from one of those 4 sources. Of course, since then, things have been, and even then, there were many, many more records that there could possibly be, but I had never recorded where I got Greta's birth from. I had many other records that confirmed who her parents were, school records that are on the Kiwi collection, and I have photographs like this one with her mother who's sitting in the middle of the front row there. But where did I get this birth from? I had no idea. I didn't even know it was really correct until I got into the school records. And then finally in 2020, I went back to Christchurch, where I'd done some research in the year 2000. And in their lovely library at Turanga, they have this card catalogue. And some great people down there have gone through all the parish records and transcribed them into a card index so you can look by families' names. And there we have Greta with her parents and her godparents being baptised and confirming her date of birth. So of course, that's the secondary source to find me the original record in the church registers. But now I know where that information came from and I can make a judge about how reliable or accurate it is. So mistake number 2 is not citing your sources, because that means that when you go back to them, you will question the reliability of it. And it also means that other people will look at things and question how good your research is. Mistake number 3. We're going to call this one Harriet's Mother. This photograph has the title Harriet's Mother. And of course, the first time we come across Harriet's mother is on Harriet's birth certificate. There is Harriet Ann Kine being born in 1874 to Robert Kine and Sally, formerly Wright. And of course, following on from that, I found her parents' marriage certificate, which says she was Sarah Wright, Sarah obviously being a variation on Sally, or Sally being a variation on Sarah. And I managed to find records in between that confirmed the relationship with her and Robert. So I went looking for a birth, because on the marriage, of course, it told me her father's name was William. And I found such a birth record in 1841, and following on from that, I found various census records. However, when I stepped back many moons later, inspired by a DNA match where I'm going, no, their tree can't possibly be right, I came across a problem. Now I'll just give you a minute to look at this table so you can have a think and yell at the computer what a silly person I've been and what might I have gotten wrong. Well, it's quite simple really. I appear to have probably two completely different people, because the later information, and of course we always have to remember we're moving backwards in time with our family history, the later information all makes sense. The ages are consistent, the locations are consistent, but the earlier ones, they've gone a bit strange. And geography is always an interesting thing, as I've mentioned before, and you need to be aware of it, because where she was in Walcott is up on the pin there near Timberland, but the ones I had for her with her birth family, she was down here in Boston and Swine's Head. So it made me think, oh dear, I've got the wrong person, haven't I? It's my mistake in my tree, not my DNA matches tree. So I went looking into the parish records, and in the Timberland parish I found, and you'll see at the bottom of the screen here, a Sarah born to a William Wright who lived in Walcott. And so when I went through and found the information for her and her life, Timberland being just a stone's throw away from Walcott, I found that my picture went from looking like this, which is terribly, you know, it's got some big inconsistencies in it, to looking like this. And that makes more sense. The ages line up, the locations line up. So mistake number 3, not looking at the big picture. I'd never looked at the facts in a sort of organised way for Harriet's mother. And so I went up the wrong tree. And I have to say I was very devastated to lose my goose branch of the family. You know, they went well with another branch, which were the ducks. And it's always good to have these interesting names in your tree. But anyway, at least now I'm looking at the right family. Mistake number 4. For this one, we're going back to Emily, Ancrosona, Pennsylvania, but we're not looking at her. We're looking at her father, William E. Wilson. Now, on Emily's marriage notice in 1872, it notes quite clearly that her father was the late William E. Wilson of Cressona, USA. He was deceased. And we kind of knew that already because there's this lovely tombstone with his name and his date of death on it. There's only one little problem with this. The tombstone is not in Cressona, Pennsylvania. It's in Lecumpha in Ireland, where his family lived. Now, of course, I'm a good genealogist, so I went looking for information on whether or not he was buried in Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is one of these states in the United States that didn't start civil registration till the 20th century, and the burial records, I found no trace of him. I found no trace of his brother, who I also knew had died in that area a few years earlier. And so we just thought that the tombstone here in Lecumpha was a memorial for him, and that, you know, they were remembering him, and it was just a case of there were no records to find in Pennsylvania. And then a while later, As often happens, I was looking through the newspapers in Ireland trying to find out more information about the family in Lecumpha. And I found this on Find My Past, a news article saying that William E. Wilson had died in Ireland. And so he is actually buried underneath that tombstone. So how did that happen? Well, it's because of assumptions we made about it. We thought he was buried in Pennsylvania, and we never thought to ask the people at Lecumpha, was he actually buried there? And they, obviously, when they sent us information about William E. Wilson's grave, thought that it was quite obvious because he was buried, that he's on the tombstone, that he was buried there. So sometimes we can make our own inconsistencies in our information by making assumptions. So mistake number 4 is making your own contradictions, and you'll end up coming to your own wrong conclusions. Mistake number 5. This one is a fun one. We're going to play a game. Do you ever remember the tablecloth game or the tea towel game or some other variation of game you played when you were young, where you had a tray of items and you had to look at it intently for like a minute, and then somebody would stick a tea towel or a tea cloth over it, and you'd have to write down or list out all the things you could remember? This is what this one is about. It involves my 4 times great-grandfather, John Key. Lovely picture of him there. John Key had 2 sons, my 3 times great-grandfather, Jonathan Muckleston Key, and an older son, Sir John Key Baronet, no relation. But of course, because he was a baronet, he appears in Burke's baronetcy, and there's quite a significant family tree in there. But I'm a good genealogist. I don't take Burke's at his word, and I wanted to research it. So from the information I found, I came to the conclusion that somewhere on this page, probably in this burnt section here, is the baptism of John Key Sr. Unfortunately, this record is so fragile that the version that they have on Ancestry is the only one that is out there. I've even asked the London Metropolitan Archives, can we get a better scan of it? And they've said no. So why is his record so singed? Well, many of you may know this photograph. It's called St. Paul Survives, and it was taken in 1940 in the middle of the Blitz. Unfortunately, the neighbouring church, the Greyfriars Christchurch, now looks like this because it did not survive. And of course, that is why its parish records have this really singed look to them. So I don't have a conclusive parish record for him. It's just a guess that that's where he is on the page. However, I do have a huge amount of circumstantial evidence. I have his father, Jonathan Key's will, which mentions him and a number of siblings, and there are a huge number of other records that mention the siblings together. I have the will of Joseph Muckleston, who was a very rich man, and for whom my 3 times great-grandfather has the middle name for. And his will also mentions Jonathan and various other members of the family. And so I have this very convoluted set of circumstantial evidence that joins the family up. But if I go and stick the tea towel over the top of this, the question I then ask is, how long will you remember what I just told you for? Will you be able to remember it in an hour? Will you remember it next week? Next month, if I ask you? Any year's time? Will you remember what I've just explained? And the answer is probably no, you won't. So the answer to that is write it down, because mistake number 5 is thinking that you're going to remember these things. And it means when you go back to your research, you're going to go, well, how do I know that? Where did that come from? How do I know that this relationship goes here? Especially when you're looking at people who may have moved distant, so moved from the country out into the city. You need to have written down not the story of your family, but how the pieces of research, the records that you have found, fit together to make the picture that you are drawing here. So always remember to write it down. Now that's the end of my 5 mistakes, but some of you who are really up on your genealogical technique might recognize this. My 5 mistakes have a little bit of a passing resemblance to a thing called the genealogical proof standard. It's been designed by the Board of Certification for Genealogists in the US. And when I'm teaching people about it, I always say it's not written in plain English and it's a little bit scary. We've done a getting it right on it, which you'll find on our website, whether you're a member of the NZSG or not. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at it. But generally speaking, the genealogical proof standard has 5 steps to it. The first one, reasonably exhaustive research has been conducted. So in Emily's case, I stopped researching her because I didn't think there was anything to find, because I just couldn't find one particular record. And that was a bit silly. The next one is every statement should have a complete and accurate source citation. Again, this is about giving credibility to your research. And something that's come up recently on it is that if you are worried about where your research is going to end up after you've passed, giving your family a well-sourced tree is actually the best thing you can give them. They can go and look for the records themselves, but if you've sourced your tree, they'll know that there's records out there to find. The third one, the evidence is reliable and has been skillfully correlated and interpreted. Like I say, no plain English in this. This I interpret as meaning take a step back and look at the big picture. Make sure that what you are looking at is making sense. And then you want to look at any contradictory evidence has been resolved. That's really important. We know that some records are less reliable than others, but we can also make our own contradictions by making assumptions, so don't do that. And lastly, as I showed you with the tea-cloth game, you need to write down how your evidence has come together. Otherwise, you're just going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what you've done in the past. So, those are the 5 steps of the genealogical proof standard. Even if you don't adhere to them 100%, having them in the back of your head as you go along is a really good idea. And I again remind you of all the resources we have in Getting It Right, which is on the NZSG website under Resources and Getting Started. So I'm going to say thank you all for coming along tonight, and do get in touch if you've got any questions, and we hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.